My name is Tom, and I've been a night watchman at the old Millwood factory for about 2 years now. The place has been abandoned for decades, but the owners still pay me to keep an eye on it. Most nights, it's just me, my flashlight, and the sound of the wind whistling through broken windows. But one night, something happened that made me question whether I'd ever feel safe walking those empty halls again. It was a Thursday, around 1 a.m., and I was doing my usual rounds. The factory is massive. 3 floors of rusted machinery, crumbling walls, and shadows that seem to move when you're not looking. I've never been a superstitious guy, but there's something about that place that gets under your skin. I was on the 2nd floor, shining my flashlight down a long corridor, when I heard it, a faint clanging sound, like metal hitting metal. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound came again, louder this time, and it was definitely coming from the end of the hall. "Hello!" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. No response. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and started walking toward the sound. My footsteps echoed loudly, and I could feel my pulse quickening with every step. The clanging stopped as I reached the end of the hall, and I found myself standing in front of an old storage room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint light flickering inside. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty except for a single workbench in the center, and on top of it was an old, rusted hammer. It was moving back and forth, as if someone had just set it down and it hadn't stopped swinging. I stood there, staring at it, my mind racing. There was no one in the room, no one in the hallway behind me. The hammer shouldn't have been moving. I took a step closer, and that's when I heard the whispering. It was faint at first, just a soft murmur that I could barely make out. But as I stood there, it grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like a woman's voice, but I couldn't understand what she was saying. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped, and the hammer fell still. The room was silent again, but I could feel a presence, something watching me. I backed out of the room and shut the door, my hands shaking. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the wind or a draft had caused the hammer to move. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The rest of my shift was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got home that morning, I tried to put it out of my mind, but the memory of that room kept creeping back in. A week later, I was back at the factory doing my rounds. I was on the 3rd floor this time, checking the old offices, when I heard the clanging again. It was coming from the same storage room on the 2nd floor. I hesitated, but I knew I had to check it out. I made my way down the stairs, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door to the storage room was open again, and the hammer was on the workbench, swinging back and forth. This time, I didn't go inside. I stood in the doorway watching the hammer, and that's when I heard the whispering again. It was louder this time, more urgent. "Leave," the voice said, clear as day. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air hitting my face. I haven't been back to the factory since that night. I called the owners and told them I quit, but I didn't tell them why. I don't think they'd believe me if I did. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I still hear that whispering, and I can't help but wonder if whatever was in that room is still waiting for me. My name is Sarah, and I've been a nurse at St. Vincent's Hospital for about 5 years now. It's not the fanciest place, but it's where I've built my career, and I've grown used to the rhythm of the night shifts. Most nights are quiet, just the hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional beep of a monitor, and the soft shuffle of slippers on linoleum. But one night, about 6 months ago, something happened that made me question whether I'd ever feel safe working there again. It was a Tuesday, and I was covering the graveyard shift in the ER. Around 2 a.m., the charge nurse handed me a set of keys and asked me to grab some supplies from the basement storage room. Normally, I'd avoid the basement at all costs. It's cold, dimly lit, and smells like mildew, but we were running low on 4 bags, and I didn't have much of a choice. The elevator ride down was uneventful, but as soon as the doors opened, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The basement was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. My footsteps echoed as I walked down the long hallway, the flickering lights casting strange shadows on the walls. The storage room was at the far end of the hall, past the old morgue. I'd never been inside the morgue, but I'd heard stories from the older nurses about how it was still used occasionally for overflow. I tried not to think about it as I unlocked the storage room and stepped inside. The room was cluttered with shelves stacked high with boxes of supplies. I found the 4 bags quickly and was about to leave when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like someone knocking on glass. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from the hallway. I told myself it was probably just a pipe or something, but the rational part of my brain wasn't winning this argument. I peeked out the door and saw nothing but the empty hallway. The tapping stopped, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. That's when I noticed the door to the morgue was slightly ajar. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I walked over to the door and pushed it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I could see the outlines of stainless steel tables and cabinets, but nothing seemed out of place. Then I heard the tapping again, louder this time. It was coming from inside the morgue. I stepped inside, my hand fumbling for the light switch. The fluorescent lights flickered on, revealing a room that looked exactly as I'd imagined. Cold, sterile, and utterly lifeless. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, I thought I was alone. But then I saw it. One of the drawers in the wall, the kind they used to store bodies, was slightly open. My stomach dropped as I approached it, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just a faulty latch. Maybe someone had forgotten to close it properly. I reached out to push it shut, but before I could, the drawer slid open on its own. Inside was a body, pale and lifeless, its eyes wide open and staring straight at me. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the worst part wasn't the body itself. It was the fact that I recognized the face. It was me. I don't remember how I got back to the ER. 1 minute I was in the morgue, and the next I was sitting at the nurse's station, clutching the 4 bags like they were the only thing keeping me grounded. The charge nurse asked if I was okay, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd seen. I haven't been back to the basement since that night. I've made every excuse in the book to avoid it, and so far no one's questioned me. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the break room or walking down a quiet hallway, I hear that tapping sound again, and I can't help but wonder if it's coming for me. My name is Claire, and I work the night shift at a 24-hour diner called Benny's Place. It's one of those old-school spots with red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, and a menu that hasn't changed since the 70s. Most nights, it's just me, the cook, and a handful of regulars, truckers, night owls, and the occasional insomniac. But one night, something happened that made me question whether I'd ever feel safe behind that counter again. It was a Tuesday, around 2 a.m., and the diner was dead. The cook, Marty, was in the back prepping for the breakfast rush, and I was wiping down the counter, trying to stay awake. The bell above the door jingled, and I looked up to see a man walk in. He was tall, with a long black coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He didn't say anything, just slid into a booth by the window and sat there, staring at the menu. "Welcome to Benny's," I said, walking over with a coffee pot. "Can I get you something to drink?" He didn't look up. "Coffee," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I poured him a cup and set it down in front of him. "Need a minute to look at the menu?" He shook his head. "Pancakes, extra butter." "Coming right up," I said, jotting down the order and heading to the kitchen. Marty raised an eyebrow when I handed him the ticket. "Pancakes at 2 a.m.? Who's this guy? A vampire?" I laughed, but something about the man made me uneasy. He hadn't looked at me once, and there was something off about the way he sat there, perfectly still, like he was waiting for something. When the pancakes were ready, I brought them out and set them down in front of him. "Here you go. Let me know if you need anything else." He didn't respond, just picked up his fork and started eating. I went back to the counter, but I couldn't stop glancing over at him. He ate slowly, methodically, cutting each bite into perfect squares before lifting it to his mouth. About halfway through his meal, the bell above the door jingled again. I looked up, expecting to see one of the regulars, but instead, a woman walked in. She was dressed in a long white dress, her hair hanging in loose waves around her shoulders. She looked like she'd stepped out of another era. She didn't say anything, just walked over to the man's booth and sat down across from him. He didn't acknowledge her, just kept eating his pancakes. I grabbed the coffee pot and walked over. "Can I get you something to drink?" She looked up at me and I froze. Her eyes were completely black, like two voids staring right through me. "No," she said, her voice soft but cold. I nodded and backed away, my heart racing. I went to the kitchen and told Marty what I'd seen, but he just laughed. "You're seeing things, Claire. Go take a break or something." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I peeked out into the dining area, and the woman was gone. The man was still there, eating his pancakes like nothing had happened. I finished my shift that night, but I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was tired and seeing things. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. A week later, the man came back. It was the same time, around 2 a.m., and he ordered the same thing, pancakes, extra butter. I brought them out to him, and just like before, the woman showed up halfway through his meal. This time, I didn't approach them. I stayed behind the counter, watching as they sat there in silence. The man finished his pancakes, left a $20 bill on the table, and walked out. The woman followed him, her white dress trailing behind her. I didn't tell Marty about it this time. I didn't want him to think I was losing it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about those two. A few nights later, I was closing up the diner when I heard a noise outside. I looked out the window and saw the man standing by the dumpster, his hat pulled low over his face. The woman was there too, standing a few feet away, her black eyes fixed on him. I locked the door and called Marty over. "Do you see that?" I asked, pointing out the window. He squinted into the darkness. "See what? There's nothing out there." I looked again and he was right. The man and the woman were gone. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept seeing the woman's black eyes in my dreams, and I woke up in a cold sweat more than once. The next night, the man came back. This time, he didn't order anything. He just sat in his usual booth, staring at the menu. I didn't approach him. I stayed behind the counter, watching as the minutes ticked by. Finally, he looked up, and for the first time, I saw his face. It was pale, almost gray, with deep shadows under his eyes. He smiled at me, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. "You've been watching me," he said, his voice low and menacing. I shook my head. I wasn't. "Don't lie," he said, cutting me off. "I know you've seen her." I didn't know what to say. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the blood draining from my face. "She's been waiting for me," he said, his smile widening. "And now it's time." Before I could respond, the woman appeared behind him, her black eyes fixed on me. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, and the two of them vanished into thin air. I stood there, frozen in place, until Marty came out of the kitchen. "You okay, Claire?" he asked, looking at me with concern. I nodded, but I wasn't okay. I quit the next day and never went back to Benny's. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I still see the man's pale face and the woman's black eyes, and I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, waiting for someone else.